In November of 1910, a group of the most powerful men in America lied to their families, used fake names, and boarded a private train under cover of darkness. They weren't planning a war. They weren't plotting an assassination. They were going duck hunting. At least that's what the public was supposed to believe. The train left from a private railcar in Hoboken, New Jersey. Curtains drawn, no reporters, no announcements. The men were instructed not to use their last names. Even the servants weren't told who they were serving. If asked, they were simply wealthy sportsmen heading south. Their destination was Jekyll Island, a secluded private resort off the coast of Georgia. At the time, it was owned by some of the richest families in the world: Morgan, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt. It was a playground for industrial royalty. But this wasn't a vacation. For 9 days, behind locked doors, these men designed what would become the most powerful financial institution on Earth: the Federal Reserve. And whether you see it as a stabilizing force or the most elegant financial power grab in modern history depends on how you understand what happened inside that room. Because the meeting at Jekyll Island didn't just create a central bank, it reshaped the structure of money itself. And more than a century later, we're still living inside its consequences. To understand why that secret meeting matters today, you have to go back to the financial chaos of the early 1900s. America didn't have a central bank in 1910. It had thousands of independent banks scattered across the country, issuing credit with very little coordination. The money supply was rigid. When harvest season came and farmers needed cash, interest rates spiked. When rumors spread about a bank's solvency, depositors would panic. And when panic started, it spread fast. The Panic of 1907 was the breaking point. A failed attempt to corner the copper market triggered a chain reaction. Banks began collapsing. Depositors lined up outside institutions demanding cash. The stock market fell nearly 50% from its peak. The financial system was freezing. There was no Federal Reserve to inject liquidity, no lender of last resort. There was only J.P. Morgan. Morgan locked the doors of his library in Manhattan and summoned the most powerful bankers in the country. He forced them to assess failing institutions and personally coordinated emergency loans to keep the system alive. For weeks, he functioned as a one-man central bank. It worked. Barely. But the lesson was clear. The U.S. economy had grown too large and too complex to depend on a single private banker's goodwill. Or, depending on how you see it, the lesson was that financial elites had just proven how indispensable they were. Publicly, politicians called for reform. Privately, Wall Street wanted control over how that reform would look. Enter Senator Nelson Aldrich, Republican, powerful, deeply connected to banking interests, and father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, Jr. Aldrich had studied European central banking systems. He admired the Bank of England and the German Reichsbank. They could expand and contract credit. They could coordinate reserves. They could stabilize markets. But here's the problem. Americans hated central banks. The first Bank of the United States had been dismantled in 1811. The second bank was killed off by Andrew Jackson in the 1830s after a populist backlash against concentrated financial power. The word central bank carried the stench of elitism and corruption. If a new central bank was going to be created, it couldn't look like one. That's why the meeting at Jekyll Island had to be secret. On that train were Aldrich and a handful of financial heavyweights: Paul Warburg, a partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company, and an expert in European banking systems; Henry Davison from J.P. Morgan's firm; Frank Vanderlip from National City Bank, representing Rockefeller interests; and a few others with direct ties to the largest banks in New York. Between them, they represented an extraordinary concentration of financial power. And for 9 days, they drafted a plan. Warburg was the intellectual architect. He believed America needed an elastic currency, a money supply that could expand during crises and contract during calm periods. The mechanism would be simple in theory. Banks would hold reserves in a central institution. In times of stress, that institution could create new reserves and lend them back into the system. Liquidity on demand. It sounds technical, and in many ways it is. But beneath the mechanics lies a profound shift. Before a central bank, money was tied closely to physical reserves, gold primarily. Credit expansion had limits. After a central bank, those limits become more flexible. The supply of money could be adjusted by policy decisions rather than strictly by metal in a vault. That flexibility can stabilize markets. It can also enable something else: sustained credit expansion far beyond underlying reserves. The Aldrich Plan that emerged from Jekyll Island proposed a National Reserve Association, a central institution controlled largely by bankers themselves. Regional branches would exist, but decision-making power would sit with private financial interests. In other words, the people who benefited most from credit expansion would help control it. Predictably, when the Aldrich plan became public, it was attacked as a Wall Street takeover. The political climate had shifted. Progressives were rising. The public was suspicious. So the plan was rebranded. After years of political maneuvering, compromises, and cosmetic restructuring, the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law in December 1913 under President Woodrow Wilson. The structure looked decentralized: 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, a Federal Reserve Board in Washington, a blend of public oversight and private banking participation. But the core mechanism remained. Banks would deposit reserves. The Fed could expand those reserves. The money supply would no longer be fixed by gold alone. And for the first time in American history, a small group of policymakers could influence interest rates across the entire economy. That power seems abstract until you follow its effects. Interest rates determine borrowing costs. Borrowing costs determine investment decisions. Investment decisions determine employment, asset prices, business expansion, and government spending capacity. Control the price of money, and you influence everything downstream. The Federal Reserve's defenders argue it prevented worse crises. Critics argue it institutionalized moral hazard. When banks know a lender of last resort exists, risk calculations change. When markets expect intervention, behavior adapts. After 1913, the financial system didn't become calmer. It became larger. It became more leveraged, and over time, more dependent on central coordination. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question that lingers beneath the story of Jekyll Island. Was the Federal Reserve created to protect the public from financial chaos? Or was it designed to ensure that the next panic of 1907 would be managed by a system rather than by one man, controlled by the same financial elite? Because once you understand how money can be expanded with policy decisions instead of physical constraints, you begin to see how the real power of a central bank isn't just in stopping crises. It's in shaping the cycles themselves. That's the part rarely discussed in textbooks. A central bank doesn't just respond to booms and busts. By adjusting interest rates, reserve requirements, and liquidity conditions, it influences how large those booms become, and how violent the busts feel when they arrive. In the early years, the Federal Reserve was still learning how to use its own tools. It helped finance America's entry into World War I by expanding credit and supporting government bond issuance. That alone signaled something profound. The new central bank made it far easier for the federal government to fund large-scale spending. War is expensive. Without a central bank, governments must raise taxes immediately or borrow at high market rates. With a central bank capable of purchasing government debt or ensuring low borrowing costs, fiscal limits soften. That relationship between government debt and central bank support would only grow stronger over the next century. Then came the 1920s. The Fed kept interest rates relatively low for much of the decade. Credit expanded rapidly. Stock speculation exploded. Margin debt surged. The economy felt unstoppable. Productivity was rising. Innovation was everywhere. Radios, automobiles, electrification. It was a new era. And then, 1929. When the stock market crashed, the Federal Reserve initially failed to provide enough liquidity to prevent a cascading collapse in banks. Thousands of banks failed in the early 1930s. The money supply contracted dramatically. The Great Depression deepened. Critics of the Fed argue that a central bank created to stabilize the system instead amplified the downturn through policy mistakes. Supporters counter that the lesson was precisely why a stronger, more active central bank was needed. Either way, the institution survived. And after the Depression, its powers expanded. By the time World War II ended, the Federal Reserve had cemented its role as the quiet architect behind the financial system. In 1971, when President Nixon severed the dollar's last tie to gold, the transformation that began at Jekyll Island reached a new phase. For the first time, the world's reserve currency was backed by nothing but policy credibility. No gold constraint, no hard anchor, just trust. At that point, the Federal Reserve's ability to expand the money supply was no longer meaningfully limited by physical reserves. It was limited by judgment and political pressure. Fast forward to 2008. The global financial system, now vastly larger and more interconnected than in 1910, began to fracture. Mortgage-backed securities collapsed. Major banks faced insolvency. Credit markets froze. This time, there was no hesitation. The Federal Reserve slashed interest rates to near zero. It created emergency lending facilities. It purchased trillions of dollars in assets through a program known as quantitative easing. The Fed's balance sheet exploded from under $1 trillion to over $4 trillion in a matter of years. The playbook was clear: flood the system with liquidity, stabilize asset prices, prevent collapse. It worked, in the sense that the financial system did not implode, but the second-order effects were just as powerful. Ultra-low interest rates pushed investors into riskier assets in search of yield. Asset prices soared, stocks, bonds, real estate, everything inflated. Wealth concentrated further among those who owned financial assets. And because borrowing became so cheap, debt levels climbed. Corporate debt rose, government debt rose, household debt rose. The economy became structurally dependent on low rates. By the time the pandemic hit in 2020, the response was even larger. Trillions more in asset purchases. Direct support for credit markets, rates back to zero. The Federal Reserve, born in secrecy to stabilize a fragile banking system, had evolved into a central force influencing nearly every major financial decision in the country. And here's where the incentives get interesting. If markets fall sharply, the Fed is expected to intervene. Investors anticipate that intervention. That expectation influences behavior before the crisis even begins. It encourages leverage. It compresses risk premiums. It creates what some call the Fed put, the belief that severe market losses will be cushioned by policy response. This dynamic changes how capitalism feels. Losses are socialized through inflation or currency debasement. Gains remain private. To be clear, central banking is not some cartoon villain story. Modern economies are extraordinarily complex. Without a lender of last resort, financial panics can spiral quickly. The panic of 1907 proved that. The Great Depression reinforced it. But complexity cuts both ways. When money can be created digitally with a policy vote, the discipline imposed by scarcity weakens. When interest rates are suppressed for extended periods, capital allocation shifts. Zombie companies survive. Asset bubbles inflate, inequality widens. And because these effects unfold slowly, they feel normal. The Federal Reserve today is often described as independent. Technically, it operates separately from direct political control. In practice, it exists within a web of incentives. Governments benefit from low borrowing costs. Markets react violently to tightening. Political pressure builds during recessions. The institution born at Jekyll Island was designed to appear decentralized and balanced, public and private intertwined. That hybrid structure has always blurred accountability. When inflation rises, who is responsible? When asset bubbles form, who is accountable? When inequality widens because asset prices outpace wages, where does that trace back? In 2022 and 2023, inflation surged to levels not seen in 4 decades. The Fed was forced to raise interest rates aggressively. Markets convulsed. Bond prices fell. Regional banks faced pressure as unrealized losses surfaced. For the first time in years, the cost of money wasn't near zero. And suddenly, the system looked fragile again. That fragility raises a quiet but persistent question about the meeting in 1910. Did the architects of the Federal Reserve create a stabilizer? Or did they create a mechanism that allows financial cycles to grow larger than they otherwise would, only to require even greater intervention later? Because every time liquidity is injected to solve a crisis, the baseline shifts. Debt levels start higher, asset valuations start richer, expectations of support become more embedded. The power to influence money is the power to influence time itself, to pull future demand into the present through credit expansion. But borrowed demand must eventually be reconciled. Back on Jekyll Island, the men drafting the plan likely believed they were solving a structural weakness in American finance. They had seen panic. They had seen collapse. They wanted coordination, elasticity, control. What they built has endured for more than a century. It has steered the economy through wars, depressions, booms, bubbles, and pandemics. It has also concentrated extraordinary influence in a small group of decision-makers whose meetings, unlike that first one in 1910, are now public, but whose long-term consequences remain deeply complex. The irony is almost perfect. A secret meeting designed to prevent financial panic gave birth to an institution that now sits at the center of every modern crisis. So the real question isn't whether Jekyll Island was a conspiracy. The question is whether any system that holds the power to create money out of nothing can ever truly be neutral. And if the price of stability is permanent intervention, at what point does the cure quietly become the condition itself?